Welcome to our second Bible study on this Gospel of Mark. We're going to try to make them always fairly short and sweet. So normally when I do a Bible study, it's about an hour. But my goal here for these, because they're in the middle of a worship service, that they're only 10 minutes long. So just a real quick slice of looking at this Gospel and providing for maybe those of you that aren't used to a Bible study kind of a first taste or a first interest in getting engaged in this Gospel of Mark. And so today we're going to be looking at Mark chapter 1, verses 21 through 45. And so we're just going to get straight into it. The beginning of Mark couldn't be any more logical. It's set out in a perfectly orderly way. Jesus appeared on the scene, was given the seal of approval from God by God shouting down God's approval from heaven during Jesus' baptism. And then he's further tested in the wilderness by the forces of evil and cared for by the forces of good. Then he finds the right people down by the sea, the beginning of his crew of disciples. And now he has to officially launch his ministry. Where should he do that? Just like clockwork, Mark chapter 1, verse 21, we find Jesus head to the synagogue. They went to the Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, he entered the synagogue and taught. They were astounded at his teachings, for he taught as one having authority and not as one of the scribes. Now, one commentary sets out the synagogues in that time in this way. The synagogue was primarily a teaching institution. The synagogue service consisted of only three things: prayer, the reading of God's word, and the exposition of it. There was no music, no singing, and no sacrifice. It may be said that the temple was the place of worship and sacrifice. The synagogue was the place of teaching and instruction. The synagogue was by far the more influential, for there was only one temple. But the law laid it down that wherever there were 10 Jewish families, there must be a synagogue. And therefore, wherever there was a colony of Jewish people, there was a synagogue. If a person had a message to preach, the synagogue was obviously the place to preach it. Jesus is different in his teachings. Whereas a scribe gets their authority by referencing the law, the Torah, Jesus taught with personal authority. It is this way because I say it's this way. And this is not something that's usually done, unless he can back it up, which Jesus does in nearly every verse of Mark, especially going into the next section. Just then there was in the synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying with a loud voice, came out of him. They were all amazed, and they kept on asking one another, "What is this? A new teaching with authority? He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." At once his fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. One of my favorite things about reading commentaries on this section is the way they always note that we didn't get to hear what Jesus actually taught, just that he taught with authority. But I don't think Mark, the author of this gospel, would agree with them. For verse 21 tells us Jesus taught. Then Jesus does something. And then in verse 27, someone in the congregation said, "What is this? A new teaching with authority." Now, what Jesus did, an exorcism, is not something we'd normally point out as teaching. And yet Mark has this member of the crowd do exactly that. Why? This is what teaching looks like in Mark. Some teachers describe in great detail how to build a house with plans and theory and a complete history of architecture. And other teachers simply put a hammer in your hand and walk you out to a build site. Jesus is a put a hammer in your hand kind of teacher. And we could get deep into this section, but for the sake of time, I'll simply ask this question. Why is an unclean spirit in the synagogue? What it hits home to me, and what I think this teaching was meant to hit home to all these listeners then, and all of us listeners now, is that we all have some unclean part within us, even those of us who regularly go to church. And part of the teaching we must learn is that through God we can remove those parts of ourselves that were never meant to be there. There is definitely a personal message for all hearers in this section. But we must not lose sight that Jesus is presenting his credentials as this Holy One of God for all to see. And he does not disappoint. As soon as they left the synagogue, they entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they told him about her at once. He came and took her by the hand and lifted her up. Then the fever left her, and she began to serve them. That evening at sunset they brought to him all who were sick or possessed with demons, and the whole city was gathered around the door. And he cured many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons, and he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. In the morning, while it was still very dark, he got up and went out to a deserted place, and there he prayed. And Simon and his companions hunted for him. When they found him, they said to him, "Everyone is searching for you." He answered, "Let us go on to the neighboring town, so that I may proclaim the message there also. For that is what I came out to do." And he went throughout Galilee, proclaiming the message in their synagogues and casting out demons. Everyone is searching for you. Let us go to the neighboring towns. Jesus heals in the synagogue. Jesus heals in a home. Jesus heals a possession. Jesus heals a fever. Jesus heals a man. Jesus heals a woman. Jesus is all things, in all ways, to all people. People do their best to limit Jesus and how far he'll go, but Mark does the opposite, showing you through all those all-important direct actions just how far Jesus will go. And we're not even out of chapter 1 yet, and he goes to everybody and does all things. Verse 34 tells us, "And he cured many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons, and he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him." Probably the main theory on why Jesus wouldn't allow the demons to shout out who he was and why many times he orders people to tell no one is that according to earliest accounts, Jesus never referred to himself as the Messiah. And so the thinking goes that in order to counter this well-known fact, while maintaining that Jesus was in fact the Messiah, Mark has Jesus quiet, while others, including demons and disciples, shout the truth from the mountaintops. Others have answered this more simply by saying this attempt to keep Jesus' identity quiet is simply good storytelling, as the people interacting with Jesus wouldn't have known who he was, but the reader definitely would. So how do you keep them engaged, that reader? A good secret, of course, what's known as the messianic secret. My answer to this has always been more simple. Jesus always seemed to be a one-on-one, intimate relationship kind of person. In fact, he seems to flee more often than not when the big crowds surround him. So if word kept getting out about him and all that he was and could do, could he really have had those quiet, intimate conversations that mirror our relationship today with God? I've always thought Jesus kept it secret and asked others to keep it secret as crowd control, pure and simple, because we have a God that loves us heart to heart. But throughout all this, as we talk about powerful Jesus, miraculous Jesus, healing Jesus, Messiah Jesus, Mark doesn't let us forget that Jesus was also a human, as we are reminded in verse 35. In the morning, while it was still very dark, he got up and went out to a deserted place, and there he prayed. A big part of the story of Jesus is that he was God, yes, but he was always one of us. And he needed to take time alone, like sometimes we do. He needed to pray off alone, sometimes like we need to. He needed to be refreshed, which I think is an important note right now, as so many people struggle in so many different ways. We need to be reminded that we aren't meant to just bear it or get over it. But in being like Jesus, we need to take time for self-care and to look after ourselves. For in loving our neighbor as ourselves, we also must love ourselves. And that last part, chapter 1, verses 40 to 45, that's going to be the topic of the sermon today. So thank you for joining us for this Bible study. And yes, on Monday, check back on Facebook for more links to different helpful materials and this Bible study itself. We're going to try and give you as many options as we can going forward. Just ways for you to dig deeper if you want to, or to not if you don't want to. Thank you for joining us for this Bible study.